I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. Our guest this week on the Poetry of Predicament podcast is Gina Bates. Gina has recently gotten herself out through a undergraduate degree and a graduate degree in the psychological support of people like activists in the both the climate and the climate justice populations. And my questions for her today is how on earth she keeps her heart open and keeps herself hopeful of finding gainful employ in a world that is so apathetic or even aggressive against this kind of activism, much less the support of those activists. Please help me welcome Gina Bates. Hey there. Welcome back to another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast. I am your ever-present host, Dean Walker, and behind the Poetry of Predicament, which is, of course, a YouTube channel, there's also a body of work called Living Resilience, and there's various kinds of support groups, one of which is called Safe Circle, and that's on every Tuesday night on Zoom. And would love to see y'all there if you haven't visited us already. And a number of online courses and events and so on in a new Mighty Networks platform, which is also called Living Resilience. So that's all the stuff that's behind the scenes here in Poetry of Predicament. Today, I'm really pleased to offer you kind of a spontaneous combustion. I'm on Twitter from time to time, and I got to say, I've had a long run now of being very inspired by the people that I happen to have connected with and in contact with their threads in Twitter. And so I was on one of those threads and particularly evocative, those of you who watch this podcast or are part of this work already, you know that I have a lot of attention on, a lot of care for the activist community around the world and the immense odds against any activism really being useful or effective in this world. I don't at all mean to be saying that to discourage anyone from being an activist in this world, but I do mean to bring as much sobriety to the conversation as possible, because I'm greatly discouraged by the scale of gaslighting and suppression of true news and supportive supply of what's actually going on in the world, what actually are the levers and dials of government and policy around the world that are being controlled exclusively by those in power, those in corporatized environments, and so on. So one of the people that was on one of those threads that I was particularly interested in recently is a woman named Gina Bates, and Gina Bates is our guest today. And I'm going to ask Gina to introduce herself and give you a sense of her, how she's had her entree into these conversations. What is it to be an activist now? What is it to be someone who's wants to make a difference in some way, shape, or form in terms of perhaps the social sciences and how they intersect with what is obviously a global need of new ways of being with one another, new ways of creating communities, new ways of having activists have actually an important and included voice at any kind of scale. I started to get hints of that in just this little Twitter thread and a couple of her comments.
So we got in touch recently, and she was kind enough to say yes to this interview. So what I'm hoping this will be as useful and valuable for you, the listening audience, the viewing audience, as it is for me, is we get a chance to hear from somebody who's really been in the trenches of what is it to be, in a academic approach to this extraordinarily troubled world. And now we're actually going to be going further, now that Gina is reaching out to try and get some meaningful employment in what is supposedly the most open and inviting employment field or opportunity filled world that we've seen in decades. And I think that there's some really, really hard truth behind that veneer that we're going to hear about from Gina as well. So, Gina, let me get you up on the screen with me here. There we go. And I just want to welcome you here. Thank you so much for just fielding this odd question from a guy out of nowhere, and really
Thank you.
appreciated our earlier conversation to kind of get to know one another and just see if there was a conversation that wanted to happen. And I just really invite you to share as much as you are comfortable sharing about what's your experience of, first I would love to hear, if you would, what your education was like, what sort of areas of focus started to come clear for you, because it was important enough that you did the research that you did at the scale you did, and then you brought it up in that Twitter thread. And it's just a little ripple, but it was enough to get my attention. Absolutely. So I think you're on an extraordinary track. And just to give people a sense of what we were talking about before I hit the record button, you also got my attention that this is this is not such an opportunity filled world. There's really a grinding environment of for me, quite discouraging, corporatized, commodified participation that, what is invited by the corporatized world for us to participate in can be quite discouraging. And so I don't want to put words in your mouth. I'm just trying to relay, some of what I have felt over these years, and especially recently. So welcome, Gina Bates. Great to have you here. Would you tell us a little bit about who you are, what you've been doing, what's your interest in that got you into the educational track you've
Yeah,
been in, and then out to this place now where you're reaching out to get some employ in this area. So welcome.
yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Dean. I really appreciate the intro and the background. So my journey started last September. So September 2021, I entered a master's program, childhood development and well-being in Manchester, England. And I went into it always having this idea that I was interested in mental health literacy. I've always kind of been a big picture person. So thinking about how can we on a big scale teach young people about mental health so they can recognize any mental health challenges in their friends, in themselves. How can they communicate about it? Because I've I've always thought that, at the end of the day, through my own experiences and through things that I've read and seen, people only know what they know at the end of the day. And if we're not encouraging conversations about mental health, and now my interest is more so about climate change and mental health, if we're not as adults kind of taking the lead on that, whether it be in schools or with fellow adults, whoever it might be, like with young people or older people, then it's going to not be talked about. So I'm all about how can we bring up these difficult conversations and make it something palatable, something that people feel empowered to talk about themselves and feel like they have the tools, the resources, the language to talk about. And so it started off very mental health based. That was my main interest. And then throughout my first few months in this master's program, I started thinking about how much climate change was impacting my own mental health. And I was really starting to get quite anxious and be in those initial phases that you feel helpless, you feel like you don't know what to do. But I knew that there were activist groups out there. I knew there were local, even more like localized efforts going on. So I thought I would try to channel my anxiety into some kind of action. I've always been very much a doer. I like to talk to people. I like to get to know people in the community anyway. So I thought that would be a good way to bridge those two. So I started getting involved in a few different groups in and around Manchester that were all related to climate change in some way. And through that experience and talking to people, I started to realize that these climate activists are doing a lot. A lot of them are working part-time or even working full-time and still finding time for activism. They're burning out very quickly. A lot of them don't really, I mean, just in brief conversations, talking about, oh, I didn't really get to sleep. I'm on these Zoom calls for like 6 hours at a time, talking about planning for protests and things. And I just got me thinking a lot about what about the mental health of these really important, in my eyes, important people doing this really important work. So I felt like, okay, if I can't full-fledged kind of join this activism in the way I would want because of my master's, and I was really focused on that, why don't I at least channel my access to research and ability to do my own research through this university to kind of like highlight these people. So that's kind of where it all started, was very much like a slow rolling, like every little encounter, I was like, thinking about that in a different way. And it all kind of led up to this research that I eventually did, which is about the perceptions of climate activists and how they facilitate their positive psychological well-being, which essentially is just to say like their positive well-being, because a lot of the current research people may or may not know related to climate change and well-being or mental health in general is not specifically focused on climate activists, which I think they deserve their own research because they're very specific subset of people who choose to go that extra mile and do these actions that maybe put their life at risk, or they risk getting arrested, tons of things that could add extra distress. And also, sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second.
Okay, let me help you find that train of thought. I just want to I want to mention a pretty well-known research program that was put out, I want to say 2 years ago, approximately. It was Caroline Hickman on one side of the, on the UK side, and then a team of people from the US, including Britt Ray and others on the US side. And I'm sure you're aware of that. And I think that's what
Yeah.
you're talking about, the kind of more general, I mean, I'm thankful as can be that this scale of research is being done. It's like 10,000 young people from different countries around the world. It was really the most extensive young people's mental health currently, and particularly with regard to these existential global environmental concerns. And, in a nutshell, yeah, they've lost trust in the adults in the world, and the incredible results, findings from that report. But what I hear you saying is that while as important as that is as a first very good cut at an important field that needs deeper and deeper research on as time goes on, you're saying that it's a more specialized environment or population, that you're talking about people who take it that extra step to being active, to being activists in this world. That is a different level of engagement, and it has its own specific mental health challenges, not to mention just psychological, just endurance challenges. If you're working a full-time job and you're as aware as you need to be active as an activist, that's an extraordinary upscaling of the stressors of life.
Yeah.
So I think that's what you're saying was really motivating you to want to find out, how are these people coping?
Right.
What sort of inner resources can they call on? And I hope that brings you back to the thread you were on, because it does seem like a very distinct population that you had your attention on to do that work. So take it from there.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Because I should mention that the other reason that I was motivated to do this research is because this is such like a rapidly growing field of research, this intersection between psychology and environmentalism or ecology, however you want to name it, these various research fields kind of intersecting. And also it started off really focused on how is physical health impacted by climate change. And there's been less conversation about the mental health impacts. So as someone in psychology who's really interested in that, I also thought, well, there's all these researchers doing this really important research, but it also is so new. Like almost all of the research I cited is from like 2015, 2016 to now. It's super, super recent. So you're right. Yeah. All of that research has been really important in informing kind of the direction that I went in. And I think much more research needs to be done on the end of looking at the general population.
Yeah.
But to focus on climate activists, I guess, was a particular interest to me as well, because of just the relationships that I had built with activists, and kind of feeling like I'm aware also that within activist groups, they sometimes will have like a wellness, well-being team of people who specifically supports their group when it comes to mental health. So the fact that they have those groups kind of highlights the fact that there are going to be extra struggles that come with being an activist.
Right.
And trying to support one another in that group is really important. So so basically I took the direction of interviewing climate activists to kind of try and understand how are they, what are their perceptions about their well-being and about their journey through activism and through these different stages of activism? And how are they maintaining well-being? And are those facilitators of well-being sustainable for them? Because I guess the one thing that I kind of wanted to emphasize and continue going back to in my research when I wrote it up is the fact that like any activist movement, if you want it to be sustainable over a longer period of time, and considering that climate change is going to continue to like intensify, and activists will likely want to continue doing their activism, sustainability of your own well-being is really important, because if all these activists are going to burn out and not know how to come back from that burnout, then we won't have a sustainable climate movement.
Right.
So that was kind of an important piece of my research that I tried to look into, but probably could use research added to my research to find more about.
Right. I'm curious if I could ask a question. An area of specific interest for me,
Mhm.
I'd like to just spell it out for you and just see if it does it resonate with any part of the threads that you've been focusing on. And that is, this piece that I mentioned about Michael Mann is representative of, there are a number of parents for future kind of groups, people
Mhm.
who are motivated primarily about the concern for their own children, for the children of this planet, and how to create a more conducive, life affirming environment for those children to grow up in. And between folks from many of those groups and folks like Michael Mann, who he's basically, in his most recent book, he removed the climate deniers from his spotlight. Whereas before in other talks and books and so on, he's made it an obvious point that we need to eliminate this whole notion of being a denier of something that is just purely physics, that like on the planet, this stuff is happening. And so to be a denier of it is like to deny gravity, kind of a thing.
Mhm.
It's a pretty serious thing if you take that population, which admittedly is getting smaller, thank goodness, but he's taken those out of his spotlight and he's put in a different population of people to be the focus of his kind of wrath, saying these are now the people that are most destructive to positive movement in terms of climate change and reducing emissions and so on, all the climate change talking points. The population he's replaced the deniers with could be called the people he and others often call doomers.
Mhm.
People who will say, what we are seeing is that we are not looking out at a potential future. We're in a future in which we are currently in an environment in which these things are happening. The collapse
Mhm.
of human-caused collapse of various Earth systems and human systems is occurring now. And we would
Mhm.
be really foolish to pretend like more isn't coming soon. That's
Mhm.
more or less what I understand. What these people who are called doomers are basically people who are saying, yeah, this amount of this stuff is already happening, and that
Mhm.
we are foolish to think that we are going to stop it all when
Mhm.
so much of it is already occurring. That
Yeah.
includes people who are wanting to feel what is very, very appropriate to feel if we are to acknowledge it's already happening.
Mhm.
So that's what I've heard Caroline Hickman, her voice is ringing in my head from so many times I've heard her say, these are completely appropriate feelings for anybody to have, especially people in activism who are more aware and vibrantly engaged with these issues than anyone else on the
Mhm.
planet. So these people are
Yeah.
not being alarmist, they're being real. This is my
Mhm.
interpretation, and obviously Caroline Hickman's. These people are not being alarmist and inappropriate and somehow the problem that's keeping us
Mhm.
all from being successful in terms of turning things around. These people are giving it their best attempt to metabolize a very natural and wholesome and important set of feelings of
Mhm.
human beings looking out and seeing what they're seeing in this world, which includes, obviously, at the top of the heap, grief. If we're in a grief phobic
Yeah.
culture, and there are some people who are seeing what's going on and they're wanting to actually start to metabolize, to feel that grief, that
Mhm.
they will seem like outcasts. They will seem unusual. They will seem like, what's wrong with those people?
Yeah.
That's what I'm really afraid that we're seeing people with as big a platform and a microphone as somebody like Michael Mann, making these people the real villains going on in our world. That's a big concern for me. So thanks for sitting through that whole layout of, why I reached out to you, because I saw a
Mhm.
thread that seemed similar in
Mhm.
concern, like, if somebody's going to be an activist and they're going to take on activism as something that's sustainable as an expression, they must be able to metabolize these feelings, or the
Mhm.
not feeling those feelings will actually
Mhm.
be what exhausts them right out of their activism. So I'll stop
Yeah.
there. Again, thank you. And I wonder if that
Yeah.
sparks anything for you.
Yeah. I think I've seen similar uh discussions about doomism, and some from Michael Mann, some from just other many various accounts that I follow. And I think I the way I initially had understood it was this idea that people who are engaging in climate doomism are basically giving in to the corporate narrative, and the narrative that fossil fuel companies want you to kind of follow, and by saying, oh well, there's nothing you can do anyway, so you might as well just say we're doomed and move on, and it is what it is. And then it's this idea of allowing the fossil fuel companies continue business as usual because people aren't as motivated to necessarily disrupt things in the same way through activism. So I had initially kind of understood it through that lens, and then in talking with you and then seeing other things, I also saw it in this harmful way, in the sense that it's because I think in the sense of kind of what I was just mentioning, like encouraging people to just say, oh, well, we're doomed anyway, so no point, is harmful in its own way, because it could potentially prevent people from thinking, oh, it's worth my time to kind of engage in this movement, or in whatever way people want to engage with climate change. But on the other hand, there is the extent to which people who are especially activists and people who are really engaged in the conversation about climate change and are very aware of the science and the new reports that come out, the IPCC reports and things, there is an element of like, this is happening now, and I mean, even watching the news this morning, they're talking about the storm that's going to Florida called Ian, and how, it's going to be really intense. It's just like, but they never call it what it is. And sometimes I get really frustrated and I'll talk to people about that. And then I know I'm being very like doom and gloom, if you will, but also like I'm also just being realistic. So I can see it from both sides of it, I guess, depending on how you're talking about doom. But I do think to an extent, like, you never want to be that person who's in the room who's like being all doom and gloom about climate change, but also it is the reality that we need to face if we're
Yeah.
going to do anything about it.
Yeah.
So it is a complicated thing, but I don't think by any means people should be villainized for it.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
regardless of the reason for that, for them being doomists, it's something that needs to be explored. Like, why is that what people are ending up doing, and how can we support people through that,
Yeah.
as a community, rather than just kind of writing them off as bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It seems to me that there's already at least one group that I'm aware of that, I'm deeply impressed by how quickly they took themselves to scale
Mhm.
and how real their platform and their way of interacting with one another and supporting one another has been at every turn. And that group is Extinction Rebellion.
Mhm.
I think they're a wonderful example of what I think you and I are both trying to point at, is how very, very important it is to be able to tell the truth with people, especially about these existential issues, but to be able to tell that truth, and in the next breath be able to say, and I'm expressing these concerns in this group in which
Mhm.
we all know what's going on. We all know these very, very uncomfortable truths about what's going on in our world. And we have chosen to stand together
Mhm.
in an extraordinary way to get the attention of the public at large, and especially of the corporations, the government agencies, and so on, and bring an expression of our love of life, our love of our communities, our respect for the communities, whether they're involved with us in our activism or not,
Mhm.
to be able to say we have some possible solutions we bring
Yeah.
with our annoying ways of shutting down traffic for a while, or
Mhm.
gluing ourselves to a bank, or whatever it is this week.
Mhm.
We actually have ideas that are about coming together in a
Mhm.
significantly different way.
Yeah.
And we're doing that even though we have an extraordinarily bold truth that we have learned about
Mhm.
what's going on. So we are not discouraged by that truth. We are fully activated together to bring the best that we can to our community. As so, what are the alternatives?
Mhm.
What can we do in the face of those truths? So I just wanted to, speak my deep positive regard for Extinction Rebellion, and their, sure, they're pissing people off where they are, but they're getting attention like I don't know of another activism type of expression at scale, especially in the privileged world, that has come on so quickly, and again just been so committed to being real at every
Mhm.
level. So I'm wondering if you have any connection with folks from XR or anywhere else that you have are aware of, that where they're doing good work.
Yeah, I agree. I think, the other day, sometime last week, there was an XR protest in Boston, and, they stopped traffic and they put out a big banner and kind of highlighting the fact that, Boston, a coastal city, could very well be underwater at some point in the maybe near future. We don't know.
Mhm, mhm.
And, I'm reading this thread on Twitter, and, those threads on Twitter either make me very happy and hopeful or just mad. um, but, it's all these people just saying, oh, like, thanks for making me late to work, or thanks for starting my day off in such a horrible way. Um, and other people saying, oh, if you care so much about the planet, why would you use materials to make a banner? Like, isn't that wasteful? All these things that are just, I don't know how to describe what they are.
I have a clinical term for it. A bunch of
Yeah.
bullshit.
Yeah. That's true. It is a bunch of bullshit. And it's just, I admire the people in XR who just keep going regardless.
Yeah.
I even saw, like, XR from Boston had put out a notice or a letter or something on their Twitter saying, apologies to everybody who we disrupted with our protest this morning. We're doing this for not only us, but for you, for people who don't realize the impacts that this is going to have. And just with so much kindness, like, despite all these horrible things that people say, they're just always kind. And I hope that one day some of these people who are so mad or anti will maybe say, what, regardless of what happens, like, wow, like, I should be grateful that they either tried to do something or did successfully do something with regards to climate change. But I don't know, I do admire them, and I know in the UK there's a group called Just Stop Oil, if you've seen anything that they've been doing. And they kind of sparked some inspiration throughout the EU. Like, I know that at one point there's some protesters that glued themselves to art in different art galleries. And then them doing that then encouraged some protesters in Italy to do that. So I thought that was kind of like a cool, kind of inspiring, it inspired kind of this ripple effect of, like, across countries even, of these ideas of what they can do to get that same attention and that same news coverage. Because without them, nobody talks about it.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
so it is powerful. It's powerful. And I do admire them for putting their bodies in the way of traffic and
Yeah.
potentially, scary things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I got a couple of other questions for you.
Mhm.
One, you were sharing with me before we started recording about just how difficult it is for you to be coming in freshly out of that master's program. You've got a pretty clear idea of what you'd like to be doing out there
Mhm.
in some sort of, I don't know, non-governmental organization or some way to bring your passion, your education, your experience into some kind of employment, gainful employ. Like, how can you actually do what you're ready to do?
Yeah.
And it's been a pretty discouraging process for you. And I'm wondering if you'd, like to share any part of that how it's looking out ahead, or the layers you've been through up till now. Anything you'd like to share about that process?
Yeah. Yeah. I'd say, I guess I'm at a point where I've never been fully clear about what I want to do. And I guess that's a big part of that, is because I kind of believe that, they've always said that young people now might have jobs that don't even exist yet. And I still believe that I might be one of those people. But the whole concept of creating my own job role or starting my own kind of nonprofit is right now overwhelming and unfeasible. So scaling back from that, I have been applying to various positions, whether it's just strictly related to mental health, related to climate change, or somehow kind of a combination of the two. Although there's not a lot of job roles that kind of require that intersection of knowledge right now, unless you're doing research. But so ultimately, I've just been frustrated by the process, and just, I guess, because I have read up and watched various, whether it's a documentary or an episode of John Oliver, to be honest, about various companies that present themselves in one way. Like, I can't remember the name of the various companies, but the John Oliver episode I watched that was about carbon offsetting, and talking about these companies that are set in place to help, like, corporations and wealthy people, like, buy carbon offsets. Those corporations themselves are corrupt because they're selling carbon offsets that aren't, like a forest, for instance, that some company can say, oh, we're saving it, but it was never under threat in the first place. So if that forest was never under threat, then that's not a carbon offset. That's not how that is meant to work. In addition to all the other issues with this carbon offsetting, like, idea and plan. But it's like, to think that there's so many organizations out there that someone who is passionate about the environment, climate, ecology might think, oh, they're doing such a good thing. And then you look into the depths of it, and it's just still disheartening. So I guess that's my long-winded way of saying that I am also being kind of picky, because I really do, I want to do work that I feel is meaningful and that I feel aligns with my morals and values. And I guess, like, sadly, there's just not a lot of opportunity there, because those are usually the smaller, less funded, community-based sort of nonprofits or groups or whatever it might be that can't necessarily hire a lot of people. So it's really been this frustrating kind of back and forth with myself, and kind of trying to decide, like, at what point do I just say, okay, fine, I'll go work for XYZ corporation. Yeah. So it's a frustrating journey,
Yeah.
and I'm sure other people in my position have experienced it as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, as I said before, I am really sorry that is the way of this world right now, and I
Mm.
can only imagine what it's like to look into that horizon, as even obviously the near horizon, like today,
Yeah.
but it doesn't look a whole lot better as we look out a year or two or three and so on.
Mhm.
Um, to shift to one last question that I have for you, and please include anything else that you'd like to include as we spend these last few minutes. My work in living resilience is to offer support. Let me give you the elevator pitch, the long one. Living resilience has been created to offer transformative support and resources to people bravely facing human-caused collapse of Earth and human systems. That's the long one. I was proud of that at that point, because before it was like 2 pages. I got it down to that, and I thought that was pretty good.
That is good, yeah.
But I've taken it down to a bare minimum stripped down version, in which living resilience is profound resources facing troubled times. And primarily what I'm offering is what I had to dig into deeply to be able to write the book that I wrote called The Impossible Conversation, when I had come to my own realization that what I had known was coming since I was a teenager was actually coming about 50 years or more sooner than I thought it was. And it really shifted me in a massive way about, I don't know, 10 years ago. I just gave it all up to be of service to life as best I could. And that's what this work is about. And mostly what that means is practices that I can use daily to somehow keep my heart open in the face of the things that you and I have been talking about. And that's for me, that's not an easy thing. And so this is a long-winded question for you of, I'm curious, how are you keeping your heart open? How are you staying? I don't really use the word hope anymore. Like, how do you stay hopeful? I won't use that word in this question for you. I would say, how do you keep yourself present to life, to the miracle that this life is? That you and I are having this conversation is a miracle on so many levels I can't count. But this world is designed for us to just grind that up into some sort of commodified normalcy that has us be bored. Where so much of this world is, especially the privileged world, we're just bored and don't want to hear about these uncomfortable conversations. You aren't built like that, evidently. You have a very active heart. You have whatever you would call this miraculous thing called life. You're obviously still connected with it. So I'm curious, how do you keep that heart open? How do you stay connected with the important thing that it is to be alive and engaged and of service, perhaps, to the people you love? How do you do it?
That is a good, difficult question, I have to say, because it's not something I've often thought about. Because I think, to be honest, from when I was in preschool, to be honest, like my parents and teachers often would just say that I was usually the kid in the classroom who thought about everyone but themselves and was very empathetic. And yeah, I guess it's always been something that's been with me. I've always kind of thought about like other people and how unfair this world is, and kind of been curious to know more and how I can help and what I can do with my position and privilege to kind of help or uplift people or empower people in whatever way I can. And yeah, I guess more recently, when it's been more challenging to kind of be present at least. I've really done a lot of meditation. It's not something that I've ever found easy. And to be honest, for the longest time, when I tried it years ago, I actually really didn't like it, or I thought I didn't like it.
Me too.
And yeah, right.
Yeah.
Because I am not really one to shut my brain off in that way. I mean, no one really does, I guess, naturally, but I guess this past year, when I tried it again, I kind of just restarted from ground zero. Like, I've found a lot of peace with it. And I think it's helped me in a lot of ways, just sort of have moments where sometimes if I'm sitting and eating a meal with my family and, I have 1,000 other things on my mind, but I'm able to sort of just let those things pass through and just focus on being with them in that moment. And outside of that, I also just personally make sure that I stay engaged with the things that have always brought me joy. So, like, exercising and being outside as much as possible. Like, moving my body is very, like, cathartic for me.
Yeah.
And doing a lot of, like, hands-on things, like whether that just be drawing, like doodling, or writing, things that I feel like almost physically ground me because I'm connecting myself to something in the room, is really what has helped me. But I guess when it comes to kind of keeping my heart open to the rest of the world, I just think that, and it's something I've always been curious about, really, and maybe I should read some research on, but I have, it sounds so obnoxious to say, but I have, like, just an unusual level of empathy, I think, where I just feel things so deeply for other people in the world that I don't think that would ever go away, for me, no matter what state the world is in.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing those practices, and especially the kind of context you have behind it. It's really the fabric of who you are, from that empathetic kid in elementary school
Yeah.
that the adults around you kept noticing, like, this is how it's how you are.
Yeah.
And what I was hearing, if I could put it into the language of the kind of practices we exchange and share and support each other in here, I'm hearing that there are a number of different kinds of practices, and that's certainly what I found as well. And I seriously, I tried really hard over years to just take on a strict mindfulness practice, particular kinds of meditation I was taught as a teenager. And I struggled for years, sincerely. And I ended up having to come up with my own variant of meditation that would work for how I operate in here. And to have it stop being such a, like, slamming my head against a wall kind of the frustration of, this doesn't work for me. So in the language of this body of work, we talk about a number of kinds of practices. Each one has a way of being of service to our system, this body system. One is, of course, the quieting or settling practices, the contemplative practices. There's a huge importance to being really able to self-regulate, to be able to co-regulate with other people. In other words, bring ourselves back to center volitionally. There's a really important to that, and I do have those practices. There are also activating practices that I was hearing you say, like, you need to move your body. You need to move your body, and there's nothing contemplative about that side of the practices. It's like, get the breath going and get the energy moving. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that's how it shows up for me.
Yeah,
And that's a
definitely.
vitally important part of my various practices that I do. And then the third one, amongst others, but the three primaries, is what I would call desaturating practices. And that comes from having now lived a lifetime immersed, saturated in this business as usual paradigm, which goes into every cell in our body, and it informs and overwhelms us to just toe the line, do what this paradigm wants you to do, and be a cog in the wheel, and shut up, and not be an activist, and not be someone who's difficult or different or brings up the hard conversations and so on. And so I think it's equally important to have desaturating practices to be able to get some amount of face above water, to be able to come up with some other way of being. What is it to be an authentic human being without being saturated in this all the time? It's a vitally important question that I don't think many people get to ask themselves.
Yeah, that is a
So
really important one.
yeah, so you're welcome anytime you'd like to come and visit and check out what this body of work is. It would be a delight to have you involved with any portion of that, community of practice, or any of the support groups, or, to bring your knowledge and your experience and your passion, your empathy, would be a welcome piece anytime. And, Gina, it's just been a real delight to have you here and to share so generously about, what's life is like for you at the age you are, the level of experience you are, the level of intention that you have brought to getting yourself on this path, and how challenging this path is to realize. It has, I call it generous because, the world would like us to think that everything's just rosy and everything's just fine. And if everybody just be quiet and don't bring up those difficult conversations, that the American dream especially will prevail, and everything will turn out just fine. And probably not. And yet somehow, through that realization of probably not, you appear to be on a pretty life-affirming track. So congratulations.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah.
Yeah, I appreciated the opportunity to talk about all of this. And, it is, I mean, even conversations like this are part of what helps me kind of keep going, just being able to just get it out, talk about it, release it from my brain for a second. So thank you for that.
Yeah. And if, with your permission, I'd like to include your Twitter handle in the show notes if people wanted to follow your expression in the world. And if there are other ways, you can just let me know when we sign off here, and I'm happy to include whatever you're comfortable with. And
Yeah,
again,
definitely.
just thank you. And I guess, is there anything you'd like to just kind of close up our conversation with? Any last words that you'd like to offer to folks?
I guess I would just say to people that try your hardest to not let people get in your head and stop you from doing what you in your heart want to do. Because that's what I'm doing. So find comfort in knowing that there's at least one other person out there doing the same.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, bless your heart. We're about to sign off, and I'd ask that you just hang on for a few moments after I turn off the recorder, and so we can finish up in a good way there.
Yeah.
And again, just thank you for sharing what life is like on your particular path. And I hope that's a useful thing for others who are on a similar trajectory. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.